Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 6 lecture, where today we're going to be discussing supervision and treatment of offenders who have special needs. So the learning objectives for this lesson are that by the end, you should be able to identify the various treatment options for drug-addicted offenders, such as drug courts and therapeutic communities. You should be able to analyze the issues that are inherent in the supervision and treatment of offenders who have a mental illness, to describe the characteristics of a mental health court and a veterans court, be able to list the specific strategies that are used for supervising and treating sex offenders within the community, as well as understanding how supervision of an undocumented person will differ from supervising a citizen or permanent resident. So first we need to start by discussing intensive supervision and specialized caseloads. So between 10 and 15% of probationers or parolees are actually eligible for a specialized caseload. So a intensive supervision, probation or parole is just simply an enhanced form of supervision. So the offender is going to be closer surveilled, they're going to have more conditions that they need to abide by, and they're going to have greater treatment exposure. So the assumption was that by having smaller caseloads and closer surveillance on these offenders, that it would deter them from committing future crimes. However, it didn't have that effect. What we saw instead was that probation officers and parole officers simply detected more technical violations and more crimes because they were more closely surveilling and keeping closer tabs on those offenders. Still, it's important that you have intensive treatment as an important component to intensive supervision. So you don't want to just have intense supervision as was the thought in the beginning, that just if you have closer supervision, more surveillance of the offender, then we can stop them from committing crimes. But what we found is that we actually need intensive treatment to go along with that if we want to see those outcomes. So today, ISPs are simply known as specialized caseloads, where the officer is going to develop an expertise in that area. So this can be areas such as sexual offenders, mental health, drug and alcohol addiction, as well as undocumented persons. So high-risk offenders are going to actually receive an intensive cognitive behavioral treatment, and change is going to be treated as a process here. So for these offenders, we're going to give them a certain degree of non-compliance that we're going to allow to happen because it's expected that these offenders are dealing with other underlying issues that's affecting their criminal behavior. So we want to just increase the direct contact with the offender so that they have an increased program completion. It's been shown that the more contact a probation officer or parole officer has with the offender, that they're going to be more likely to complete those programs that they're placed in. So let's start with offenders who are addicted to drugs and alcohol. So over half of the offenders who were on probation were actually under the influence of drugs or alcohol during the commission of their crime, or it contributed to their crime in some way. So 1/3 of prison admissions are actually for drug offenses. The quality of drug treatment is going to vary greatly, and we need to make sure that our sanctions are tailored specifically to the treatment plan, which you all completed for your last assignment. So continued drug use on probation is very common, and it's a common reason for why offenders are having their probation or their parole revoked. So we need to make sure that we're putting them in the proper programs and having the proper treatment plans to address these issues. So cognitive behavioral relapse prevention programs actually retain offenders throughout the reentry process as well as their parole period to see those greater lasting effects of reduced use of drugs and alcohol. Sometimes prescription medications are needed and are used. So antabuse is used specifically for those addicted to alcohol. So antabuse alcohol is a way to remember that. And then methadone and naltrexone are actually opiate based, so they're going to be used to stop offenders or help stop offenders' cravings for opiate based drugs. So drug courts are one of the ways that we can actually help these offenders in the community. So a drug court typically lasts about 1 year, and there's 4 phases to it. These actually began in Dade County, Florida in 1989. So in this drug court, all parties are going to work together. So you have the judge, the prosecutor, the defense, as well as probation. And for juvenile offenders who are placed into a drug court, the parents may actually be required to be involved. These are considered family drug courts. To be eligible for a drug court, you have to be a nonviolent drug offender, have a moderate substance abuse issue, and you must participate voluntarily. So you cannot force an offender to participate in a drug court. So we also need to address the fact that there are gender responsive strategies that need to be used. Women typically abuse substances for reasons such as coping with trauma, to self-medicate, and also to maintain significant relationships with others. For example, maintaining a relationship with a boyfriend. A lot of women we see start to use drugs because of the man that they're involved with. They think that they need to continue using those drugs for that person, for that significant other, to continue loving them and being with them. Men, however, use drugs and alcohol in more social and public contexts. So men actually tend to have better completion rates with drug courts and drug treatment because they were specifically developed for men and geared toward men. It wasn't until recent years where we started realizing that women can commit the same offenses that men do, and we understand that women have different pathways to crime that need to be addressed. So women are actually more successful when they're placed in gender specific rather than mixed gendered environments, specifically related to drug treatment. So drug courts actually can reduce recidivism by between 37 and 50%, which is great. And they are most successful when they're able to use leverage against the offender in order to hold them accountable, as well as when you have capable staff. So you need to make sure that you have staff that understand the issues that come along with drugs and what it can create as far as leading to crime. And you need to make sure that you have enough time for treatment to occur and treatment to really stick. That's why these drug courts last about 1 year. We also have therapeutic communities that can be used. So these are residential community facilities that the typical stay is between 6 to 9 months, and it includes aftercare. So therapeutic communities are long-term treatment places specifically targeted to drug addicted and alcohol addicted offenders, or those who are addicted to multiple drugs who are amenable to treatment and who want treatment. So you see here that it says polydrug users. That simply means that they're addicted to more than one drug or drugs and alcohol combined. So the therapeutic environment is that the offender must be motivated. So they have to want the treatment. The environment is highly structured and is actually run by peers who are considered leaders in that environment. So these are offenders who are towards the end of their process in this therapeutic community, and it helps the offender who's just starting out to see that, okay, this is where I can be, and this person truly understands where I'm at and what I'm going through. The challenges, however, are that we have low retention rates in these communities. The different types and uses. So it's used as a diversion typically, or a transition for the offender instead of going to prison or jail. So you can, as far as diversion goes, you're diverting them from going into the prison or jail system, or a transition from prison or jail into the community before they go into a community supervision. You can also have individual counseling or group counseling. And then cognitive restructuring. So this is where we're going to specifically focus on re-socializing clients to having new thoughts, new attitudes, and new behavioral choices that are not pro-criminal, that are pro-social instead. So that was your drug offender on supervision. Let's look at the mentally ill offender. So as a direct result of deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, as well as a huge lack of community mental health providers, we now have the largest, so jails and prisons have the largest mental health communities and populations in the country. So let me say that again. Jails and prisons are the largest mental health institutions in the country. The most mentally ill offenders are in jails and prisons. That's terrible. And on top of that, the cost of confining an offender who's mentally ill in jail or prison in special housing because they have special needs that need to be addressed, it actually costs 2.5 times more than a regular inmate. So not only are we putting the mentally ill into prisons, they're costing the taxpayers more money than if we could just improve our community mental health providers. So it's actually estimated that 16% of all probationers have general mental health needs that need to be met. This means that there's a good portion of your probationers that even if you don't have a specialized caseload, you're still going to need to be aware of the different mental health issues that are out there that could be affecting or possible underlying drivers to your offender's behavior. Additionally, between 5 and 10% of parolees have a serious mental illness that is going to require them to be on medication as well as to be on continued therapy. In the juvenile system, we see that 2/3 of boys and 3/4 of girls in juvenile facilities had one or more diagnosed psychiatric disorders, and that 25% of these are so severe that the juvenile cannot function properly. So what do we do about this? Well, we have mental health courts, very similar to your drug courts. So again, they're diversionary. They're going to use a team problem-solving approach. So again, you have all of your main players, your prosecutor, your judge, your defense. You'll have probation involved, and you're going to have weekly court hearings. So every week, the offender and all of these parties are coming together to discuss how that offender is doing and to make sure that they're complying with whatever special conditions they were given. To be eligible for a mental health court, you have to be diagnosed with a long-term disorder that affects daily functioning. You also must voluntarily be willing to participate in a mental health court. Again, we're not forcing anyone to participate in these. Good mental health court programs are going to address not only the mental health aspect and the other special conditions that go along with probation, but they're going to address homelessness because we know that's a main issue that plagues those with mental health disorders. They're going to address transportation. So we want to make sure that that offender is being able to get to not only their mental health court appointments and court hearings, but that they have transportation to their medication appointments, to their psychiatric appointments, to their psychologist, to their counseling. And it's also going to address medication. So it's going to make sure these good programs are going to make sure that the offender is participating with their medication and is compliant with their medication. Those who are successful in mental health courts do show fewer new charges and fewer rearrests. So when you're a probation officer or a parole officer, you may have a mental health caseload. So this is one of those specialized caseloads. So you'll have an officer who is specially trained in mental health issues. So you'll have additional training, and you're also going to have a reduced caseload number because there's much more that goes into it, as you saw on the previous slide with mental health courts, to working with a mentally ill offender. So it's very important as a probation or parole officer that you have positive working relationships with treatment providers because you want to make sure that you are in contact with those treatment providers, weekly even, making sure that you're understanding how they're doing in treatment. You also want to ensure compliance with medication and counseling because the mentally ill do tend to be less compliant with those obligations. And then you want to use problem solving with that offender. So problem solving in your appointments, when you go out to meet with them at their home or at their job, and scheduling them for court appearances rather than revoking probation or threatening revocation to help gain compliance from that offender. So you're not going to gain compliance from a mentally ill offender simply by threatening to revoke their probation or by actually revoking probation. because they have an underlying issue driving their criminality or in juveniles delinquency. So you want to use problem solving with them. Hi, Johnny. I noticed that you haven't been taking your medication the last 2 days. Could you explain to me what's going on? Why do you feel that you don't need to take the medication? What's been happening? Do you think we need to schedule you for a court hearing? Do we need to go back in front of the judge and see if there's something else we can do for you here to make sure that you're taking your medication? Maybe there's another avenue that we can make sure this is happening. So again, you want to work with that offender using your motivational interviewing skills instead of simply just revoking their probation. So then we have outpatient community clinics. So for mentally impaired offenders who are not a danger to themselves or others and who voluntarily wish to participate in one of these outpatient community clinics, it's a chance for them to avoid an incarceration environment while also taking part in ongoing treatment. So in these in these outpatient community clinics, you'll have a licensed cognitive behavioral therapist as well as 2 case managers typically assigned to an offender, and they do show reductions in recidivism. So we're recognizing that we don't always need to incarcerate the mentally ill or the mentally impaired, that what they really need is proper treatment. And by doing it in an outpatient fashion, we can keep them out of an incarcerated environment. We can save our taxpayers and our prison systems money and overcrowding. And we can also make sure that we're letting that offender remain in the community and get the treatment that they need. So similarly, we have these community-based residential facilities. So community-based residential facilities are inpatient facilities. The previous were outpatient, where the offender is not staying there 24/7. This inpatient facility, however, the offender will stay there 24/7, and it's an alternative to a jail setting, so it's a little bit more of a step up. Typically, the offender will spend between 3 to 6 months in one of these facilities, and it's for those offenders who need a little bit more structure and a little bit more treatment intervention, but they're not quite ready to be released or to be on that outpatient status yet. All right, one of our last populations we need to discuss are justice-involved veterans. So we know that 1 in 5 military service members will actually return from overseas with some form of PTSD. Typically, this is caused by combat exposure or the recurrent use of explosives. 10% of our prisoners today are former military veterans. So what options do we have for veterans in the justice system? Well, we have veterans courts. So again, these courts are always going to be diversionary. So veterans courts will require that the offender participate in counseling, sometimes that they take medication, especially if they are diagnosed with PTSD. We also know that homelessness, just like with the mental health population, is a huge issue for justice-involved vets. So we need to make sure that we're addressing homelessness. The courts, for veterans courts, will actually assign a court-approved mentor to that veteran to make sure that they're being compliant and so that they have someone who specifically understands what they've been through to talk with, because most probation and parole officers are not going to have that same experience. And then most veterans courts also require that the individual was honorably discharged to participate in the veteran court. And those who do participate in these courts do show lower recidivism rates. So now we go on to our sex offenders and how we supervise sex offenders. Well, the period of supervision is typically longer for sex offenders than it is for any other type of offender. It requires very intensive training, a lot of time, and a lot of resources. So we know that the majority of convicted sex offenders will end up serving a portion of their sentence in the community, but we also give them more conditions than other offenders will be given. So some of the different treatment options that we use for sex offenders are polygraph tests, which a polygraph just detects deception, which we know a lot of sex offenders use deception with their victims or have used it with their victims. So by using these polygraphs, we can reduce their secrecy and deceit that they're able to use because we're showing them that you can't lie to us anymore because we can tell when you're lying. So it's also going to help measure treatment progress. However, these are not admissible in court. So we use them for treatment-based purposes only to see how the offender is progressing in their treatment. And then we have penile plethysmograph, which actually helps to identify the gender and age of the offender's victims. So it measures erectile responses. So it's attached to the offender, and they will show the offender different pictures, videos of different age, gender of different individuals. So it's going to help us identify the arousal levels of that offender to different genders and ages of persons. So it can also be used, though, to help show how we can to help show the offender how they can control their urges and then replace those urges with appropriate behaviors. And then there's also chemical castration, which we're all familiar with. So McCune v. Lyle in 2012 addressed the fact that sex offender treatment programs, such as the ones listed above here, do not violate an offender's Fifth Amendment right to self-incrimination by making that offender acknowledge their past crimes, because it's part of the rehabilitation process and one of the first steps in helping that offender take responsibility for their actions. So a lot of the polygraph tests and a lot of the sex offender treatment, like counseling, it starts off by making the offender admit to what they've done and admit to their offenses. And again, it's part of the rehabilitation process. We want to make sure they're taking responsibility for their actions. So it says that it doesn't violate their Fifth Amendment right to self-incrimination, because in some of these cases, the offender may actually end up disclosing additional victims or additional offenses. So with a sex offender, while they have the lowest recidivism rates, so let me say that again, sex offenders have the lowest recidivism rates, except for those who have been convicted of sexual assault or those who have failed to register for the sex offender registry. Typically, though, when a sex offender is rearrested on a new crime, it is for a non-sexual related offense. So we use this containment supervision approach, which has 6 components, to specifically address sex offending behaviors in the community. So it involves 2 to 4 face-to-face contacts between the officer and the probationer each month, so you're seeing that offender nearly weekly. 2 home and computer searches per month of that offender to make sure that they're living where they say they're living, that they don't have any materials that they're not supposed to have in their home that are sexual related, and to make sure that they don't have any of that material in their computer as well. They will have to undergo thorough mental health evaluations, as well as weekly cognitive behavioral therapy groups or individual counseling, or both. And then regular staffings with treatment providers and a polygraph examiner. And finally, you need to have sharing of information between the probation officer and the treatment provider. Remember, I said it's very important that a probation officer has great relationships with treatment providers so that they can make sure you have a back and forth flow of information to keep that offender accountable, but also to make sure that you can give them credit where credit is due when they're doing well in treatment. 10 states will actually require an offender to be on GPS monitoring in addition to these other components here for life. 10 states require that an offender will be on GPS monitoring for life when they're considered high-risk offenders. So what are some other special conditions that a sex offender may have to abide by? 1, that they may have to provide a blood and saliva sample for the DNA bank. So you may be saying, doesn't this violate unreasonable search and seizure? It does not. Bowling v. Romer, the court ruled that requiring an offender to give a blood and saliva sample does not violate their right against unreasonable search and seizure because it's a minimal intrusion on their rights and that offenders have diminished constitutional rights anyway. Some offenders may be excluded from child safety zones, so think of parks, playgrounds, schools, and they may be prohibited from viewing pornography and even visiting sex-oriented businesses, so think of like your adult stores. And finally, most sex offenders have restricted internet access. I know in the juvenile system we always do this. So the offender will be given limited access to the sites that they can see, the apps they can use, because again, depending on their specific offense, it may lead to them reoffending if they're given too many avenues to reoffend. So let's take a look at some sex offender registration laws. So sex offender registration laws actually stem from Megan's Law. This law says that law enforcement must make information available to the public about registered sex offenders. Interestingly, in Texas, 8.5% of sex offenders were juveniles, and many of them were considered more high risk than adult sex offenders. So in Connecticut Department of Public Safety versus Doe, we addressed the issue of the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause and in relation specifically to sex offender registration laws. So the court here said that the public posting of the offender registry does not violate the 14th Amendment. And then more specifically in Smith v. Doe, the court ruled that these registration and notification laws also do not violate the Constitution's ex post facto clause because the act regulates rather than punishes the offender. However, we know that these laws do negatively impact the offender's ability to work in certain places, to live in certain areas, and even their ability to successfully reintegrate. The court was very specific, though, in saying that these laws are not intended to be a punishment, so while there may be negative implications that come along with it, the intention is not punishment. It is simply to regulate, to know where the offenders are, and to make sure that the public knows where these offenders are, so that in that way it is not violating the ex post facto clause or the 14th Amendment. So you can actually go to this link here. I'm not sure if it'll click on the PDF or not, but it's the National Sex Offender public website where you can put in an address and you can see how many sex offenders are registered around that address. And it will actually show you there's 3 tiers to sex offenders. And depending on the tier will depend on how much information is available on that offender. So you have your tier 1, which is your lowest risk. Tier 3 is going to be your highest risk. And the risk levels here are the risk to commit another offense. So these community notification laws say that information about sex offenders must be available upon request of any community member. Certain community notification laws can actually authorize or require that law enforcement agencies disseminate information about sex offenders who are living in the community. The amount and type of information to be disseminated, though, will again depend on that offender's level of risk. So like I said, when you go to that website, it'll, depending on their risk level, they'll give you certain information. However, we have real questions about whether these notification laws actually make communities safer from sex offenders. So most people, when polled, say that 1, they don't even check the sex offender registry, and 2, even if they do know about a sex offender living near them, they don't change their habits or take any proactive measures to guard against being a victim of one of these offenders. And again, remember, they have the lowest recidivism rates. So a lot of these offenders will have those residency restriction laws. So a lot of these offenders may not live within 1,000 to 2,500 feet of any child safety zone. They're also ineligible for public housing. So we know that offenders in general struggle with getting appropriate and proper housing when they're returning and reintegrating back into society, back into their communities. But we're making it that these offenders have an even tougher time to find a place where they can live. And there's these laws about residency and where they can live are unfortunately based on a faulty assumption that an offender's home is where their crime typically occurs, because it's not. The crimes typically occur somewhere outside of their home. And the last population that we need to discuss here are undocumented individuals. Your book uses the term illegal aliens, and the reasons for these individuals coming to our country illegally are typically out of a need to feed their family, escaping violence in their home country, or having a lack of resources in their home country. So they're coming to the United States. The majority of undocumented persons do not commit crimes. However, those that do typically commit drug crimes. That is the number one crime that undocumented individuals will commit, are drug crimes. The second highest crime that they'll commit are visa crimes or immigration offenses. So again, just the fact that they came to the United States illegally or overstaying their visas. So in sum, intensive supervision programs are going to require very close supervision as well as cognitive behavioral therapy interventions. Drug courts are diversionary and will help integrate drug treatment into the offender's regimen. Mental health and veterans courts are problem-solving focused and will link offenders to services within the community. Therapeutic communities use peer support and cognitive behavioral interventions to help the offender avoid relapse on drugs or alcohol. Sex offenders are a heterogeneous group who engage in deception and manipulation. Sex offenders do require intensive supervision, intensive treatment, and special conditions. Sex offender registration and notification laws are for public safety, not for punishment. And lastly, most undocumented offenders commit drug-related or immigration offenses. So this was your Chapter 6 lecture on special populations and how we supervise and treat those different populations. I hope everyone has a great week.